Guys, in this video, we are going to learn how we can use circular progress in our React applications when data is loading. You will find a link to this Material UI documentation in the description. So you can explore more on what kind of progress components are available in Material UI. But in this video, we are mainly going to focus on circular progress. Before we start coding this application, subscribe to my channel for more such videos. So guys, I have a fresh React application here, which is running on localhost 3001. So let's go to the Visual Studio Code and start building this application from scratch. And before we do that, we are going to install Material UI in this application. So I'm going to open a new tab and search for Material UI install. So here on the first link, I should be able to find a command to install Material UI in my application. So I'll copy this command from here, go back to my Visual Studio Code. So this is my fresh React application. So in this application, I'm going to open a new terminal and I'm going to paste the command to install Material UI in this application. So now Material UI has been installed in this application. I'm going to remove all the default code that we have here in the React application, and we can start by putting hello world and save it. And let's go back to the browser and see if our application is working fine. So this is working fine as of now. So we are going to make some imports into this application. So I'm going to import React from React, and we are also going to make some imports from Material UI. So I'm going to import button from Material UI. I'm also going to import circular progress from Material UI. And this is the main thing that we are going to learn in this video, how to use this circular progress component. So in this application, what we will do is we will try to fetch some data from some online API. And when the data is fetching and it's still loading on the screen, we'll try to use this circular progress to let the user know that data is still loading in the application. So to do that, I'm going to just create a button here in place of hello world. Let's name it as load data. So on this button, I can say the variant is going to be contained. So let's go back to the screen and now we can see one button here. Let's give a margin top to this button and try to bring this button in the middle of the page. So here I'm going to mention styling on this button and I can say margin top to be 5%. So now this button has come down a little bit from the top. So next thing we have to put some on click function on this button. So when somebody clicks on this button, there is actual data that's get loaded on the screen. So let's add an on click function on this button now. So on this button, I'm going to create an on click function. So when somebody clicks on this button, I'm going to call a function that is handle load data. So as of now, we don't have this function here in the application. So I'm going to create this function that is handle load data. So as soon as somebody will click on this button, this function is going to be fired. And in this function, we are going to fetch some data from a open source API, for which I'm going to leave a link in the description. So I'm going to fetch a data from a URL, which you will find a link in the description. Then so whatever the response is going to be from this API, we are going to console log that response into our application. So in this handle load function, I have written a simple logic where we are fetching the data from an API and then we are converting it into JSON and we are logging this data into the console. So I'm going to save all this and go back to my application to see if the logic is working fine. Let's open the console just to see if we are able to load the data from that API. Once we are in the console, I'm going to click on load data to see if we are able to load data. So as soon as we click on load data, we can see that that API is responding with some data. So this data is basically related to countries and each country has a name. And there is a lot of other information that's available related to the country, which we are not going to need. We are just loading this data to understand how to use circular progress into our application. So we are going to pick the name of the country and display that on the screen. So we are able to see the data on the screen along with the console. So I'll make some changes to the application. I'll go back and in the application, I'm going to create one state variable here. And the state variable is going to be data. And we can initialize this state variable with an empty array for now. And here in the handle load data function, instead of logging the data, I'm also going to do one more thing. I'm also going to set the data variable to whatever the response is there from this API. So whatever data we are getting as a response from this API, we are saving it in data variable here. And here in the return after the button component, let's go ahead and display this data. So we are going to loop over data. So I can say data.map. Go to each and every item in the data and we are going to display name of each country here in the screen. So I can say item dot name dot common. Let's save it. So let's load the data once again, and now we can see that we are able to see all the name of the countries that we are getting as a response from an API. So let's understand why I have mentioned why I'm looping over the data, and I have mentioned it as item.name.common. So basically the response that we are getting from an API is an array. So we are going to each and every element in the array. So in that element, I'm finding the name property and the common property and displaying it on the screen. So if we look at the data here carefully, let's open one element, that is element 0 in this array. So if I open this, so in this element I have a property that is name, and I have another property that is common, and the value in that property is Moldova, and that's the reason we see the first name as Moldova on the screen. So basically we are going to each and every element in this array, and the total number of elements in this array are 250. So I should be able to see the name of 250 countries on the screen as soon as I load data. So let's refresh the application again. And when I click on load data, the data is loaded from an API and it's shown on the screen. So this API is responding very fast here. As soon as I click on load data, I'm able to see the name of the countries because the API is responding very quickly. But in some cases, there can be scenarios like when we click on load data, the API is taking a lot of time to respond. And during this time, we want the user to wait, and we want to display some kind of circular progress on the screen to let the user know that data is still loading. So we are going to try and do that. So let's go back and make some changes in the application here. So here in the handle load data, because our data is loading very quickly, I'm going to intentionally delay the loading of data. So I'm going to put this entire fetch logic from an API inside another function, that is data. So I'm going to create another function inside this handle load data function, and I'm going to cut this logic from here and put it inside this data function. And I'll delay the loading of data by using a function that is set timeout. So in the set timeout, I can call data after 3 seconds. So basically when we click on load data, it's going to take 3 seconds to load the data on the screen because of this set timeout function. So let's go back to the application and see how it has changed. Thanks here. So I'm going to refresh the application again, click on load data. And you can see that it took 3 seconds to load data on the screen, but there was no circular progress there. So we are going to add a circular progress between these 3 seconds. When the user clicks on load data, so we should be able to see circular progress here to know that data is loading. So to do that, I'll make more changes to my application. So here we already have imported circular progress from Material UI into this application. Let's add this circular progress after my button here. So after my button, I'm going to create another div element, and inside this div element I'm going to add this circular progress component that we have imported from Material UI. Let's save it and see what's happening on the screen. So here on the screen that this circular progress is displaying on the screen after the button. So let's refresh it. So the thing is, it's always displaying. We haven't actually clicked on the button, and if I click on the button, even after data is loaded, circular progress is still displaying on the screen. So we want to put a condition here that circular progress should show only when user clicks on load data, and after the data is loaded on the screen, the circular progress should disappear. It should not always show here. So we need to put some condition here, and to do that I'm going to create another state variable in our application, and this is going to be loading, set loading. So I can initialize the state variable to false. So in the initial state of the application, the loading is set to false. And in my circular progress, I'm going to say that if my data is loading, that means if my loading variable is true, then only I'm going to show this circular progress. So if I save it, go back to my application, now the circular progress has disappeared because we have initialized loading variable with the false. But when we click on load data, it doesn't appear back again because loading is always false. So what we will do is, as soon as user clicks on this data load data button, we are going to set loading to true, and as soon as loading is set to true, we should be able to see the circular progress here. So on handle load data, I'll go there and I'll set loading to true. So initially loading is false, we should not be able to see any circular progress, but as soon as somebody clicks on load data button, loading is set to true, and because the condition is that if loading is true, we should be able to see circular progress. So let's test this logic on the screen. I'm going to refresh my application again, and as soon as I click on load data, I'm able to see circular progress. And once the data is loaded, the funny thing is circular progress is still there because loading has been set to true. So we need to make some more changes into this to make this work. So what we want is, after the data is loaded, we want to set loading back to false also to make it disappear after the data is loaded. So I'll go back to the handle load data function. So as soon as somebody clicks on that button, this function is fired and loading is set to true. But after we got a response from the API, and after we have set data to response, I'm going to set loading to false back again. So after the data is loaded, the loading is back to false again. So initially loading is false. When somebody clicks on the button, loading becomes true. And after the data is loaded, loading becomes false. And we have a condition here that if loading is true, then only we should see the circular progress. So this logic should be working fine on our screen. Let's go back and test. So I'm going to refresh this application again, and I'm going to click on load data. So we see the circular progress. And after the data is loaded, my circular progress has disappeared back again. So I hope you are getting an idea how we use circular progress in our React applications using Material UI. I'll see you in the next video.